is Keys of Marinus, all the bloopers and flubs and cardboard cutouts aside, is Keys of Marinus a good tale by Terry Nation?
I think it's a splendid tale. I think it's very easy to look at the first story and go, the first episode is the greatest thing ever. And as I've said before, I love the other three. And then you see the Daleks, nothing has ever been made like that on TV. And then you get a historical, well, the BBC can do historicals, that's all fine. And then you get the Keys of Marinus. The Keys of Marinus is more influential for the future of Doctor Who than any of the preceding stories and most of the stories that follow, with the exception of Dalek Invasion of Earth. Because the Keys of Marinus shows a young Stephen Moffat what Doctor Who can look like if you just cut out all the boring bits.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. We have a tremendous show for you this week, one of the longest episodes I've ever done, and I have two terrific interviews. Philip Hinchcliffe is back to talk about his third and sadly final novelization. My thanks to Philip for always taking the time out to speak with me, and my thanks as well to David Barsky for helping to facilitate those interviews in the first place. We also have Jim Sangster back to discuss his first book. Jim was on for a bonus episode a few months ago, one of the most popular episodes I've ever done, and it's great to have Jim in-house talking about the Keys of Marinus. You've already heard a brief snippet from Jim at the top of the show, but there's lots more good stuff to come, I promise. Because we have such a long show, I will keep my introductory remarks to a minimum. Better Call Saul got snubbed at the Golden Globes this week, and yes, I'm still annoyed about it. Things to talk about with the Keys of Marinus, which is book 59 in publication order, the first of two August 1980 releases. The spines are no longer white. We are now entering a long period lasting most of the 1980s where the target spines are published in vibrant colors. The Keys of Marinus in orange, and The Nightmare of Eden, which is the twin August 1980 release, also in a rich color, which we will talk about next week when this podcast covers Doctor Who and The Nightmare of Eden. There will be one brief return to a white spine, which off the top of my head is going to be 1981's The Enemy of the World. That's coming up in about a month on this show, so still a pretty long way off. But other than that, we're going to have a really cool set of color schemes all the way up until the late 1980s on the spine. And that is going to be very exciting to talk about. For now, however, we have a terrific show, lots of conversations. Let's get to it.
You are invited on an adventure across all of time and space, in a completely random order. It's the Police Box in the Junkyard podcast. Jump in the TARDIS with your hosts,
Eric Gulbranson,
Asad Kheshki,
and
Matthew Kressel.
Explore Doctor Who TV stories, audio adventures, and books, both novels and non-fiction. The Police Box in the Junkyard podcast. It's the entire Whoniverse on shuffle. The Police Box in the Junkyard podcast is a member of the Direction Point network and is available about once a month wherever you find your podcasts. You are listening to the Doctor Who Literature podcast.
And we are here today to discuss Philip Hinchcliffe's third and final Doctor Who novelization, and we are once again joined by Philip himself. Philip, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
So the book we are talking about today is The Keys of Marinus, which was published in 1980. A couple of curious things about this book. First, this was a couple of years after you had left Doctor Who and moved on to other projects. And second, it's the only one of your books that is not an adaptation of one of your own serials. So if you can recall, how did this book exactly come to be, and how did you wind up with a William Hartnell story to write?
I can't truly recall the details. I don't either. I would have spoken to Target Books and said, I can fit another novelization in. Do you want me to do one? Or maybe they contacted me and asked me. And I can't remember anything more than that, I'm afraid.
Looking at the David J. Howe book, which is the definitive history of the Target line, it mentions that Target had reached out to you in the late 1970s because Terrence Dix had been writing all of the books. And there are, of course, logistical problems when you have only one author doing 10 books a year. So they reached out to you and David Whitaker, who had been the show's story editor back at the very beginning. And each of you were asked to write a book. Unfortunately, David Whitaker passed away before finishing his, but we have yours. Do you recall if you were given a choice of story or if they said, you're doing Keys of Marinus, so please have it back in 3 weeks?
Huh. I don't think it had to be that quickly. Do you know, I really can't recall. I don't think I was given a choice because I wouldn't have chosen Keys of Marinus. So I think they probably needed someone to novelize this one.
Now, of course, there are drawbacks to writing a story that at this point was about 15 years old, and I'm not sure if the video was known to exist in 1980. So my first question related to that is, were you watching Doctor Who in its first season, 1963, 64?
I think I saw part of the very first episode. I think that's all I saw.
So you would not have seen Keys of Marinus at the original release. Do you recall if you had the chance to watch it or watch the surviving video as you wrote the book?
Yes. I wouldn't have written it if that wasn't the case. There were I don't know how many episodes this was, but they were in black and white, and some of them were not very good. I've got a feeling that some might have been on tape and some of may have been telecine copies, which in those days they used for sales abroad. Or maybe it was all telecine, which would not have been a very good quality. But I saw all the episodes, just like I did when I novelized the other stories.
Do you also recall if you had been given Terry Nation's original scripts to work with, or if you were just working from the surviving video?
I think I must have had some scripts. It's very difficult to do it just from the dialogue, having to kind of, you couldn't really, I think in those days there was no way, or it didn't exist on a VHS or Philips or Sony tape that I could look at it at my leisure and keep stopping it. So I'm pretty certain I was given the scripts and I was shown the episodes just to give me a feeling of what it looked like, what the visuals were.
What I found interesting, especially, is when we were talking about Seeds of Doom a few months ago, we talked about how you consciously omitted certain scenes from the novelization because they didn't really propel the storytelling. I have an opposite situation in Keys of Marinus. There's actually one scene that you have in the book that is not on television. I was wondering if you recall if that was your own invention or if that perhaps was in the Terry Nation script and for whatever reason did not get filmed.
What scene was that then?
It's on pages 94 and 95 of the paperback novelization, and it's during the trial sequence in the city of Millennius. The Doctor has a meeting with the two native Marinus characters, Altos and Sabitha, and they're talking legal strategy. And that is nowhere to be found on television.
Oh yeah,
It's a scene between Ian and Altos and Sabitha rather than the Doctor. I think I misspoke.
I wouldn't have. I don't think I would have totally invented that. To be honest, I think it must have been in the script. Yeah.
Interesting. I wonder why that ended up not being filled. Probably for timing reasons. Obviously, time and studio
Yeah,
space was very tight back in those days. So you had written this book 40 years ago, and you read it for the first time recently in preparation for this interview. What was the experience like taking a look at your own words again 40 years later for the first time in so long?
it was really weird. Apart from the first paragraph, I couldn't remember a word that I'd ever written of Keys of Marinus. And it was like reading a thriller by somebody else. I mean, it really, and I thought, well, that's quite good. Well, that's pacey. Oh, I couldn't remember anything at all. And I thought about this. It's something to do with the fact that the story was never in my head at any stage, unlike my other stories. And that I have a very powerful visual memory, and the visuals that I was shown, I saw in one viewing, whereas the visuals of the other programs I produced were much, I saw them several times, and they remained in my mind, and I had my original sort of story ideas in my head, and so the actual black and white version of this story was, not very memorable. I mean, that was the problem with the visuals in those days. And so I think that's the only reason that I haven't retained any of this. I mean, I take everything back. When people come up to me and say, "Oh, we like Keys of Marinus," oh no, that's not my favorite. I don't know why, because it's a rollicking story by Terry Nation. It's got lots of things in it which we could talk about. It's very pacey. It's gripping, and it keeps moving. It's full of incident. It's full of jeopardy and surprises and all the rest of it. And it's a jolly good read.
Keys of Marinus has, I think, one of the less remembered reputations from the first William Hartnell season. It was as I recall, it was a replacement script. Terry Nation was going to do a historical, and something else fell through. So they had to commission this on very short notice. And they decided to make it a succession of B movies. So every week there's a different set of sets and a different set of supporting characters or antagonists. So it's a succession of one episode stories strung out in a row. And this unfortunately strained the production budget to the limit. Now that we have these things upscale to high quality digital video, there's just so many bloopers and production gaffes. There's the use of cardboard to represent a falling human. There is a lot of crew members visible through gaps in the set. There are other visual fluffs. So that's probably why Phantom does not have the happiest memory of the story. Plus, it being a Terry Nation story without his most famous creations.
Well, yes. I think that I'm sure that reading this now, I think that I was responding to all the good elements in Terry Nation's scripts. And all I did really was to clothe the script with enough internal speculation from characters, scene setting, but mainly I think all the work was there in Terry's script. His script, I would think, was much better than the actual finished program. He was a very prolific writer. He could turn his hand to different genres on television. He was one of the early TV, commercial TV writers,
Right.
Avengers and all the rest of it. What's interesting and what you've just said is quite interesting, is because this story, I think Terry was a bit of a magpie, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but I think I'm not saying he lifted plots, but for example, you've got crime story characteristics in here. You've got the locked room puzzle, which I think goes back to Sherlock Holmes, I'm not sure. You've got unmasking the villain in a bit like an Agatha Christie sort of way, a puzzle who it is, and very well constructed possible suspects. It's very well structured. And also you've got a courtroom. So all these are characteristics of crime stories. And so I think he's just either had those in his sort of notebook and he thought, well, I'll use that one. I can't believe it. And he was working probably at great speed. So I think he incorporated that into this very forgiving umbrella format of Doctor Who, So, hats off to Terry. I think he is terrific, really. And I was very surprised. And I think that the visuals, the physical stuff and the fights and stuff like that, and, the visuals of it all, it made no impression on me at all, except they look really poor and wooden, So I think the strength of the novelization, if you think it's a good one, is in the original scripts rather than how they were realized on the screen, is the way I would put it. I think what was interesting, when I read it, you said, what was my reaction? What I noticed was that how a few scenes that the William Hartnell Doctor is in during this episode, and how much of the other leads are really got a big role to play, and the physical lead of Ian. Is it Ian? Is that the character? Yeah.
Yes.
He does a lot of the action stuff. The other two female companions are, doing stuff. They're getting in there are subplots where there's a lot of jeopardy for them, and even some of the incoming guest roles also play their role, as sort of giving all these different sort of little pathways in the narrative to keep it, and it's all done within interiors, which was the perennial problem of producing an adventure story like Doctor Who in limited interior sets. And although he stretched the budget, you tell me, it's still a very, there's pretty good dramatic unities in this story, followed by Terry. So that, I was thinking, he had the problem with Verity right at the very beginning that I had when I inherited the show, although we had more filming than they ever had in these early years of the 60s. So those were the sort of things that I was reacting to when I was reading the novelization. And I thought, it's a jolly good professional piece of storytelling, really, I mean, Terry Nation's, I'm talking about there, his scripts, very professional piece of early television adventure, really.
Two of the things that impressed me most about the book, I'll tell you one from when I was 11 reading it for the first time, and one from this past week. Talking about the more recent thing, this is a black and white story. You have a lot of descriptions of colors in this book. You describe the colors of almost everything. Do you recall if that was a conscious choice to bring to life a black and white story where we obviously can't see the colors on screen?
I don't think I thought about it like that, but I guess I was just trying to create a more sort of luminous world for the reader. I guess that was part of my novelist's sort of impulse, really, to just make it more attractive, the actual environment of the story. I don't mean to change things, but just to bring it to life,
And it works very well because, as we said, this is a low budget story which is stretched to the limit. And you are, of course, writing a book that does not have any budget cuts, so you can make things as lavish as you want on the screen. And I think you certainly took advantage of that. The other point is that when I read this at 11 years old, at my very first Doctor Who convention in 1985 in Manhattan, I recall reading most of this book in the lobby in between events, and the courtroom scenes take up a good portion, probably the longest portion of the TV story because it's spread across two different episodes rather than confined to one. And that's when I realized that I was an 11-year-old who actually enjoyed courtroom drama, which is not usually the province of 11-year-old boys. And here we are a few years later, and I've made it my career. And I found the realism in the courtroom scenes excellent, both as written by Terry Nation and as filtered through your book. Like the doctor is appointed as Ian's defense counsel, and the very first thing he does is ask for a postponement. And having that as my day job, I can tell you that is very, very painfully realistic.
Well, that must be Terry knowing a bit about that, because I didn't. Well, how marvelous that you were fired by in one way by reading this story. I mean, that's amazing, fantastic.
Well, thank you. You definitely put the seeds in my hand. And getting back to Terry Nation, as you say, this is a very adventurous script with a lot of action and movement. You had commissioned Terry Nation twice in your own ear. He had done Genesis of the Daleks, which is widely regarded as one of the best, if not the best, Doctor Who ever, and also, of course, the Android Invasion. Do you recall any particular memories of working with Terry Nation?
Not really, because he'd pretty much finished scripting Genesis of the Daleks, certainly first drafts, before I joined, or in the early days when I was there. But he was delivering the scripts, and I think that I think it probably Bob Holmes said, should we do another Terry Nation? And I think I have a memory of saying, well, yeah, but not a Dalek story. And I think I might have said, we will do some Earthbound stories. Can we do something that's a bit sci-fi? And so I think he probably went away. I didn't have personally a sort of conversation with Terry myself, although I had met him, but I wasn't involved in the actual script editing meetings. But I think we said that to him, and he said, "I know, I'm going to do an Android story," which really excited me. And I think all the Android aspects of the story that he eventually wrote were terrific. I think we fell down on realizing the aliens, but all the Android aspects of that story worked really, really well. So I think that was it. Yes, I'm up for one more Terry Nation story, but can it be something sci-fi kind of thing? And so that's how the second one came about, I think.
What's funny is the timing, because I'm actually reading Android Invasion for an episode coming out this week. So I have the American edition of the Android Invasion novelization in front of me. And whatever faults the alien mask might have on screen, the cover illustration is incredibly gripping.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Because you have Tom Baker and the android and then the crawl left to right.
The problem with actors in rubber masks is that in order to be sort of heard, they all seem to adopt, unless their voice is treated like the Daleks, they all seem to adopt a sort of booming Shakespearean delivery because they can't be heard with these rubber masks. I'm glad that the story works, but that's and also what we did, none of us spotted, was that if they've got thick fingers like that, how can they be a high-tech sort of race of people? It wasn't thought through properly on the design side, if you know what I mean.
Although the story somewhat leads into that, the villain in the Android Invasion is dispatched when he drops a vial of his own poison and it spills on him and kills him, which I guess could only happen if you have clumsy latex gloves instead of manipulative hands.
Yeah. Yeah.
So coming back to Keys of Marinus for another question, I don't know if this was in your head, but this is a 6 episode serial, and you wrote the book primarily in 12 chapters, and then there is a 2 page epilogue at the end that's called Chapter 13. Uh, when I was younger, I was always interested in stopping for the day at the cliffhanger and then reading the next episode the next day. So it was pretty easy with Keys of Marinus because your first 4 cliffhangers are all in the right place at the ends of chapters 2, 4, 6, and 8. However, you put the episode 5 cliffhanger in mid chapter, so it doesn't fall into that neat 2 and 2 structure. Do you recall when you were writing the book, if you were trying to keep the cliffhanger structure intact chapter wise, or if you were looking at other
Yeah,
considerations?
was because it seemed to work really well. And I think I did try to do that, but you've just kind of vaguely moved a memory. I think that it was difficult to do towards the end. I don't know whether there was more explanation or things moved a bit more rapidly, and so I had to. I remember thinking, yeah, hang on, I've got to find different endings, yeah, for the chapters. But I think it works when I read it anyway.
The book certainly made a huge impression on me at age 11, as we discussed. And reading it back this week, I was very much taken with the way that you tell the story in terms of the techno-thriller language and the use of color for a black and white story. You had mentioned that the Doctor is absent for much of it. So I think the very first year he was given a 2-week vacation, and he took both weeks during this story. So it leaves a Doctor-shaped hole in the middle. Fortunately, William Russell, who is still alive with us today, is very up to handling the challenge of being that secondary lead, being the two-fisted action hero in the middle bits.
Yes. Well, what I meant to say earlier was that that way of handling a Doctor, because there was speculation that maybe an elderly actor might take over before I joined the program, and Bob Holmes therefore wrote Ian Marter's Harry character in, which was just like an Ian character, to do the running and the heavy lifting, if you like. And so I thought, oh yeah, that's why. Well, I knew this really, but it reminded me that was why Robert Holmes created those the extra companion when I joined the program. He had those in the scripts, written into the scripts. It's the same problem, that they had in this story.
Ian Marter is very much like yourself, in that after his time on Doctor Who was over, he came back to the target line, and he ended up writing, I think, close to 10 books over 10 years before his very, very untimely passing. Do you know if you've read any of the Ian Marter novelizations?
No, I knew that he did one. I didn't realize he carried on and did as many as that. No, I'm afraid I haven't. No.
He has a very visceral, almost gory writing style, and he plays into the horror of the episodes that he's writing. So his novelization of the Ark in Space, for example, is much more graphic than you could have realized in studio. So if you're going to start with an Ian Marter book, I would definitely recommend his take on the Ark in Space.
Right. Interesting. Yeah.
Was there any talk of you coming back to the Target books after Keys of Marinus? Because I know that your TV career was very, very busy in the 1980s, but I wondered if you ever intended to return.
I can't remember whether they asked me or not, to be honest. Or maybe they did, and I said no, I was too busy. But I think I'd done my stint on the program then, I think, really. And also, they, as I said to you, they paid peanuts, so it was, quite a lot of effort, really. When I was doing other stuff by then.
And up to the present day, you are still generating content with Big Finish. They have released several full cast audio stories based on draft scripts of yours from the 1970s. One came out called The Valley of Death, which was based on a proposal of yours. They've also released earlier versions of the stories that became Genesis of the Daleks and Revenge of the Cybermen. Plus, you have the Philip Hinchcliffe Presents line going on very recently. What's it like working with Big Finish?
Well, the only one that I'd written was the Valley story, and the other ones for Philip Hinchcliffe Presents were brand new ideas which I'd come up with.
Wow.
And the idea to sort of the kind of stories that would fit into my era of the show, if you see what I mean. And I enjoyed it. It's great, I thought it was a challenge. I thought, well, these have to be good, otherwise, what my reputation, be nil. I worked very hard, to make them worthwhile stories. But they didn't offer me enough to do all the scripting. And I thought, let somebody else do that. And so that worked out very well in the end. And I went to just a day of recording. And what I loved was the speed of audio drama. It's so fast. And it's a different, very precise, and everyone's got their own mic and in their little booths, and and then all the effects are all put on much later on in a longer post-production period. So the actual I was quite intrigued by the way they were made. It was a sort of a rapid way of creating drama.
I think I've heard it said that Big Finish does one full cast play recording every single day of the week, so their output is prodigious. And obviously, I haven't kept up with all of it because just time-wise, but the stuff they do is very, very carefully thought out and very well written.
Yes, I think they've got a good reputation, and they're doing a lot of stuff. I didn't know it was that much. Whether I'll carry on or not, I don't know.
So speaking of your role in Doctor Who, you rather famously had one on-screen cameo during your own era. During The Brain of Morbius, there was a succession of figures from the production office who showed up dressed up as, depending on which side of the fandom debate you fall on, you were either playing a previous incarnation of the Doctor or a previous incarnation of Morbius. With the current 13th Doctor stories on screen, that bit of Brain of Morbius has been revived and has been shown again as a flashback. So your on-screen cameo has now been memorialized forever in Doctor Who. You are playing a past pre-Hartnell Doctor. How does it feel now to officially be an incarnation of Doctor Who?
Well, I had no idea about it. What story is that then?
It's a story called The Timeless Children. It came out in March 2020. It was the last story of Jodie Whittaker's second season.
Oh, right. Okay. No, somebody mentioned that, but I haven't seen it. No. Yeah, well, I mean, it was just a quick all hands to the pump, sort of thing that we all had to because we had a trouble with equity about getting actors doing it. So yeah, it's I don't really think about it, to be honest.
You've never considered your own Doctor's personality traits or TARDIS design?
No, afraid not.
Philip, thank you so much for joining us for the third time. Unfortunately, this is your last book, so I don't have an easy excuse to invite you back, except to say that you are welcome back whenever you want to talk about whatever type of Doctor Who you wish to discuss.
Thank you. Well, I'll bear that invitation in mind. And it's been a pleasure talking about these novelizations, and a journey back in time for me as well, which has been great fun. Thanks.
Me and my audience, thank you for your time and your generosity. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Jim Sangster, welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. How are you, buddy?
I'm in a terrible state. I think I've ended up in an alternative dimension because it's the space year 2023 and everything is being run by idiots. But the only safety I've got is that I know for a fact I'm not in Marinus, because there's no way any of these people have brains, whether they're in jars or anywhere else. So other than that, I'm fine.
See, Keys of Marinus is the first postmodern Doctor Who story because it's the only story to explain why the show is in black and white and not color. The Doctor says he has a color TV, but it isn't working.
Apparently there was a whole scene that was cut. I'm remembering this very vaguely. I think it was this story where that's where the Doctor was coming back from in the very first episode, and why he's in such a bad mood, because he's been to the BBC to ask them for help, but they've only got black and white TVs. And so that's why he's in a really bad mood. And when he finds two people messing around in his junkyard, he's done with their silliness. So. But that was cut. So.
I know in the War Machines novelization, the War Machines invade Television Center, which is another meta reference, but that was not on television, only in the book.
I mean, good luck with that, because I mean the ground floor that was all on a level surface, but you couldn't get up to the top floor because the lifts were always, and also the War Machines were very heavy, so they wouldn't be able to get into the lifts. And I don't think the goods lifts went up to TV Centre, but it is 10 years since I've been there. So.
Well, we're here today to talk about Keys of Marinus, and I've got my 1984 reprint copy right here. What do you think of this cover? It's got a moody outer space backdrop. It's got the sun rising over a planet like the end of Star Trek II. It's got an off-colored TARDIS with a bright orange light on top. How does this cover grab you? By David McAllister.
It's a beautiful piece of artwork. It would look great on the front of the 1980 Doctor Who diary. But I think in terms of target, it's the worst cover. It's absolutely the worst cover, because it's lacking in any kind of excitement. Now, I appreciate there was a combination of a lack of photo references, and then that was just when John Nathan Turner was coming in, maybe, or the production office certainly was saying they didn't want old Doctors on the covers. So somebody had decided that, and then there's nothing else that they can put on it. So. But as I said on my blog, I would have loved someone to have done a cover a bit like the Terror of the Autons one, but with the brains in the jar. Maybe that would be too horrific, but I would love to have seen that as the front cover.
Ooh. Now, you have been involved in a couple of projects of your own that are tangentially related to artwork, because you have, on your Twitter, you have released a novelization of a story that's never been adapted. And you have also released amazing photorealistic Alan Willow style illustrations for novelizations that don't have illustrations. You want to talk a little bit about your work there?
Yeah. So last time we spoke, you asked me, I've always got projects on the go. What's your next project? And I said, I don't know. I didn't have anything lined up. Then within a week, I was invited to illustrate 3 or 4 stories for this collection of like 7 short stories. And when I read the stories, they were all excellent. So I begged to illustrate every one of them. So there are now 26 illustrations in this collection.
Wow.
And I really enjoyed it. So then I thought, well, why haven't Target all got illustrations? They stopped after, was it Green Death? What was the last one that had illustrations in it? I mean, Planet of the Spiders has an illustration on the back, but it doesn't have any inside, does it?
Okay, so then Green Death is the last one that has internal illustrations.
And I just put it out there on Twitter saying, which ones do you wish had been given illustrations? And it was very tight. And I used my own vote to swing it to Ark in Space. So I just did a set of illustrations of Ark in Space. And then the second one was Web of Fear. So I did that. And then the third one was the Loch Ness Monster. And it's just for my own fun. But then I just put them out onto Twitter, and there was a really good reaction to those. So possibly by the time this comes out, I'll have another set of illustrations, which is Pyramids of Mars and the Dinosaur Invasion. So they should be coming out on Twitter and Facebook if you're a friend of mine on Facebook. Although I tend to keep people I've never actually met or interacted properly with onto Twitter. So, but anyway, you'll be able to see them there, and they make me laugh. Just trying to imagine how to illustrate something in a way that isn't quite how it appears on TV, and try to match the descriptions of the authors as much as possible. So, like in Ark in Space, the Auto Guard is a sphere because that's how Ian Marter described it, and the blobby collection of bubble wrap is a lot more glutinous in my illustration. So, and it keeps me off the streets. We've had terrible weather here in Manchester, so I've spent this entire weekend drawing dinosaurs and had a lovely time.
I should also point out that since you and I correspond offline, I may have seen some of these illustrations in advance, and I can tell you that people who look at them are going to be in for an absolute treat.
Oh, thank you. And speaking of treats, yeah, the other thing I did was when I actually finished writing my blog a year ago, and then it was just being published every Saturday, and I needed another little brain teaser, another little project, and I decided to novelize Dimensions in Time because I thought there is zero chance of it ever coming out as a book, and also in the spirit of the original Target books, there is very little chance of it ever being released on home video. So it is literally a story that you may have seen on first broadcast and never seen again. So and also it was an exercise for me, and just I've been reviewing other people's writing. Can I mimic that style? Can I make it a suitable Target novelization? And also, can I treat it seriously? You know, if this were a real story, and I don't mean slavishly seriously. There are jokes in there, but I just thought, what will it look like? And then I wrote it. I enjoyed it, and then I thought, I'm going to release it. I'm going to serialize it in the week leading up to the 23rd of November, the anniversary, which is so you can find that on my blog. It's available on my blog, and there's a PDF version of it available on there as well.
I will just say, from my perspective as an American kid, I didn't know the first thing about EastEnders. So when I first saw Dimensions in Time as an nth generation copy in the mid 90s, I didn't get any of the EastEnders reference. At that point, I didn't even know my London geography. So all that stuff went over my head. What's remarkable about your novelization is, number one, you fill in the plot holes and you give in-universe explanations for everything. And it's also a novelization of EastEnders, so now I have a better context for what all this stuff means.
It was funny introducing a character and thinking, how would Terrance Dicks introduce this character? Except we've met this character. And so we've got a bit of the TV history, but also this character has a history before the TV show started in 1985. So I did do some research and did some deep dives into the official histories of certain characters and who they were and where they were in their lives in the first segment of Dimensions in Time. I really did put a lot of mental effort into this. And that's when I realized that some of the things in Dimensions in Time didn't work. So I changed one of the children who's messing around. I changed the age of that character, and I brought another character in for a very, very early scene that explains how the Doctor ends up broadcasting to his own cell of the Fourth Doctor, and then explaining why Albert Square. But you'll have to read it to find out why, because it really is ridiculous. But as you say, it makes sense within the universe of a TV show that has someone flying around time and space in a phone box.
The part that had me laughing out loud is when the TARDIS materializes where Cutty Sark is docked. You give a very long explanation of the history of Cutty Sark, and then you say, absolutely none of this matters to the story.
That is a trick I stole from Stephen King, of all people. It's I remember once I think it's in It. He's describing something. It might be the boat, the little paper boat, and he says, and it sails along the road and it goes past all these houses and then it sails out of this story. I thought, wow. So I just thought, I want to have a go at doing that. Here's a big historical description of something that absolutely has no relevance to the rest of this story.
But we're here today to talk about Keys of Marinus, and we've done a very good job of not talking about it. So let's backtrack a little bit.
I was hoping to go for the record of being the most off-topic intro that you've ever had. Or, let's go for an hour. Go on, let's do the whole hour.
It'll happen one day. I'll go a whole hour without ever talking about the book. So you and I were talking offline about our birthday stories. So you and I are both John Pertwee babies. You and I were both born, in your case, during the airing, and in my case, during the production of particular John Pertwee serials. This, of course, is a 1960s story that predates both of us. How did you first discover the Hartnell era? I'm sure your story's a little bit different to mine because I had different access in the States.
Yeah, so it would be through the Target books. I was originally just going to the library, discovering that there are books of that TV show that I've seen, and they seem lovely, colourful covers. So probably the Daleks would have been one of the first. So that would be my first Hartnell. And then I know I either didn't read or didn't read all the way through the Crusaders, because when I read this for my blog, it was a completely new story to me. It was
Oh,
a
wow.
revelation of how great it was. And I know that I read the Zarbi. I know exactly where I read the Zarbi because it was my own copy, and it would have been about 1983. And I read it in the back of my dad's car because I'd been naughty, and so I had to go with my dad because I wasn't allowed to stay home and play. I was under supervision because I'd been naughty, but I was allowed to read a book in the back of the car.
Wow.
So that's when I read the Zarbi. So I probably read Dalek Invasion of Earth, and then the Christmas of 1980, I got Keys of Marinus. So my first experience of the, I don't know whether you can count the Daleks because it's a completely different, it's a reinvention of the story. So my first experience of like the very first crew was Dalek Invasion of Earth, and then Keys of Marinus, and then a year later we got to see An Unearthly Child.
The Five Faces of Doctor Who season.
As part of the infamous Five Faces of Doctor Who, and that's the point when pretty much everyone of my age stopped being a viewer and became a fan with a capital F. Because it wasn't just we watch this show, it wasn't just we buy the comic or read the books. Now it's we're hungry for more. We're hungry for stuff that was on before we were born. And that's, I think, the point when you become a fan.
Interesting for me because it was watching The Five Doctors as one of my first episodes, and then in Resurrection of the Daleks, which I would have seen a month or so later, when the Doctor mentions having had the chance to destroy the Daleks before. I'm like, wow, I want to see that story. And then, of course, my PBS rolls around to Tom Baker after Caves of Androzani. So I saw that story about a month or two later. And for me, I was getting the novelizations very early on in my fandom. Unearthly Child was part of the second batch of books that I ever got. So I got to read the origin story very, very early on. As I've mentioned earlier in this program, I got Keys of Marinus at my first Doctor Who convention in New York in July 1985 at the now defunct Roosevelt Hotel, which is a victim of the pandemic. So I read Keys of Marinus when I'd only been a fan for about 6 months, and I happened to read it on the very same day that I saw my first Hartnell episode live when they screened the movie format of Dalek Invasion of Earth at that convention, July 1985. So I read this book and saw my first live Hartnell footage on the same day.
It's a strange thing being a fan, isn't it? Because it's a bit like we're archaeologists or whatever. We're always digging up things, and it's not when the thing was created; it's when it came into your life. So I read the book of Keys of Marinus, and then a few years later, I'd met other fans who didn't go to the same school as me, who were different ages to me. And one of these fans had a collection of audio cassettes of pretty much all of the stories. And these aren't those beautiful Graham Strong ones. These were recorded from a tape recorder held up next to a TV monitor. A TV monitor. A TV. In the old days, they were just TVs,
Yeah.
So they were very kind of...
yes, we need to get the keys and we need to come back here.
It was very muffled. But I loved it. So my second experience of this story was on audio, where I was reading the book frantically and trying to follow it in time with the audio track, which is how I came to love Norman Kay's music. Norman Kay, who does the Unearthly Child and this, I think a couple of others. And I love the sound of Norman Kay's discordant. It's usually a woodwind. I think it might be an oboe or a low clarinet or something, and then a harp. And that's his music. So you just get the kind of going up the arpeggio a bit menacingly, going da, 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 pling, 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 pling. And all of his stories sound like that. Apparently Norman Kay hated his TV music. He had no love for it at all. He was really prolific, but he saw himself as this grand composer and arranger. And so he burned all of his original TV stuff. Sad little story there.
Reading the production files on the season 2 Blu-rays, so you have the director of Dalek no, that's not right. You have the director of The Rescue, Christopher Barry, writing to Tristram Cary, who composed the Daleks, asking for his tapes of the incidental score to the Daleks because he wants to reuse certain cues for The Rescue. And he mentions in one of his handwritten letters, and yes, I sat there squinting at the monitor screen, deciphering Christopher Battery's handwriting from the year 1964, saying, "I will take very good care of these copies and get them back to you because I'm aware these are the only copies in existence." Very different world back in the 60s.
Yeah. But then again, this stuff was all just made to be seen once, and that was it. You know, it was seen as just theatre that was shown a bit more widely than just one venue. So it is a complete shift in mindset to how we are probably today. Having worked, I used to work in the BBC archives, and I've seen paperwork, letters from members of the public saying, why are you sending it? Why are you showing us these old episodes of Steptoe, black and white episodes of Steptoe, and I'm paying for a colour license? And they're furious. And then it's a chance. I think it was Dudley Moore. It's always attributed as Dudley Moore, where he was on a chat show and someone said, and of course we've got all of your old episodes as well. And he says, oh no, the BBC wiped them. And suddenly there's this shift of what? And then the BBC says, well, you said you didn't want to see them again. Yeah, but we didn't want you to wipe them. Yeah, but the tapes are really expensive. So, well, couldn't you just make copies onto other tapes? No, the tapes, each tape costs about the same as a family car. We've got to be very, even now, they've got to be very conscious of the budget. And they did, though, in those days. And the technology just wasn't favourable for them to just keep all this stuff. When I worked at the archive, the thing that I came away with was not how much we've lost, but how lucky we are that how much we've kept. Even if that includes the Space Museum and one episode of the Space Pirates.
And we're lucky that all the audio exists too. The fact that all this audio exists is absolutely incredible because people were audio taping the series from the get-go.
Yeah, I mean that has nothing to do with the BBC.
That's
to be clear. So, but funny enough, a lot of the radio stuff that we still have, a lot of interviews we still have, because one woman wasn't doing her job because she was told to keep one representative sample of interviews with all these different famous people and notable people, and she was like, "Well, I can't decide between that one and these other two, so I'm going to stick the other two under my desk and hope no one notices." And that's why we've got so many recordings. People often think that the BBC has this massive plan and it's this huge monolith that's moving in the same direction. It's not. It's loads of teams, 3 people to a desk, and they're all scrambling for money because although the BBC's got a lot of money, it's spread so thin. So I'm amazed at how much survives and amazed at how much they got away with. It's when you look at these descriptions in the books of like Philip Hinchcliffe describing the set of Marinus, and he's talking of these grand futuristic sets, and you think, no, it was just a backcloth with some props stuck in front of it. It's not that grand, Phil. Look at me, desperately trying to get it back on topic.
Let me take you right back off topic because your dead accurate imitation of a 4th generation audio copy reminds me of the documentary on the Invasion DVD, Love Off Air, talking to the fans and their off-air copies of missing stories. I forget who it was. It may have been Justin Richard talking about listening to an nth generation copy of Marco Polo and being in awe at listening to Marco Polo, and then they play the audio and it's totally inaudible because it's nth generation.
That's how I experienced so much of Doctor Who until, we didn't get a video recorder until, when would it have been? It was after, I think it was the summer of 1984, that's what it would have been, because there was the only out-of-town repeats that summer, because they showed the serialized version of the 5 Doctors, and they showed an omnibus of The Awakening that summer. And that was when they were the first stories I recorded. So, but also my mum hates Doctor Who and would never let me watch it. So I had to get up really early on a Saturday or Sunday morning and record the audio tracks so that I'll go into my room and listen to the audio tracks of all of the things I had on videotape. I remember getting a terrifying headache because I'd spent the entire day listening to the audio recording of The Ambassadors of Death. And you think of all the extra noise, all of the soundscapes with the, and then the fact that it was an nth generation Australian copy. So, most of that's why I took to Big Finish so quickly, because for me, Doctor Who was as much more of an audio medium. Could I use that? No, that's not. I was trying to find some cellophane to do some sort of
Oh my goodness.
And that's pretty much how the Keys of Marinus sounded as well. But with Norman Kay's bling, 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 bling.
We got the Hartnell package on PBS in late 1985. So I would have seen Keys of Marinus probably around November of 85. And I know when my father took me to the convention in the summer of 85, and he was standing there bored at the back of the ballroom watching a few minutes of the Dalek invasion of Earth before leaving me to my own devices for the next 2 hours. He asked me how I could stand to watch the bad quality of the kinescope, which is, the film recording off of a TV screen. And I'm like, I'm just watching something from the 1960s I didn't know I'd ever get to see this. I'm in awe. And all he was doing was complaining about the poor audio quality. Of course, now, thanks to the Blu ray, we have that story so perfectly restored. It looks as if it did the day it was videotaped for the first time in 1964. So tell Dexter we've come full circle on that.
When my friends were trying to convince me to get a new TV, and they said, "Oh, it's got HD and it's 4K compatible," and it's like, I'm not 4K compatible. I watch 405 line black and white episodes of Z Cars on a regular basis. I'm honestly, I don't care. And they were so upset. In the end, they said, "Okay, don't get a new TV. We'll give you our old one, and we're getting a new 4K TV." That's fine. That's fine. You do that. And I just think often when you see these restorations, they're beautiful. It's great to be able to see things in detail. And then you look at the backdrop and think, oh, I didn't want to see a fold over the Aztec city. I didn't want to see that fold in the sky. It's, ruined it.
Yeah, Keys of Marinus, when I first saw it in late 85, I'm 12 years old. It never occurred to me to look for the bloopers or to look for the many, many production glitches. And it's not until I'm older that I was able to see, oh, look, there's a PA standing behind the door. That's not a Vord falling down the well. That is a cardboard cutout of a Vord falling down the well. That's not snow. That's not snow. That's styrofoam. It didn't occur to me until I was older to actually look at all this stuff. When you're 12, I just wanted to see Keys of Marinus because I'd enjoyed the book so much. And of course, HD doesn't do it any favors. But when I watch these old Hartnells, I'm not watching it for the bloopers or the glitches. I'm watching it for, the in-universe story. I try and tune all that stuff out as best as I can. So when I'm watching it in my head, it doesn't look as bad as it does on HD.
Yeah, I feel, especially when you're watching old TV, a lot of it feels like metaphor. If you go to a stage play, you don't expect to see a real lion. You might see someone in a lion costume, and you know that is standing in for the line in the story. And the same with Doctor Who monsters. I love Doctor Who monsters; they're my favourite thing. But I don't feel disappointed when they don't look especially real. Whereas CG is purporting to be realistic, and I find CG a lot less impressive because I can see the blurring. I can see where it loses any kind of reality. I think there's that wonderful thing with Jurassic Park where it raised expectations, but then everybody else tried to match it with much lower budgets. And for 30 years, they've failed and failed and failed. And it's only now when you see, actually, I better not say what it is, but when you see the current Doctor Who trailer and you see an element of that trailer and you think, oh, they've captured the textures beautifully there and it actually looks real. That's exciting because in the old days, to achieve that, they'd have to actually make it real. They'd have to physically make it, I mean, Agador looked real to me when I was watching him.
Agador is real as far as I'm concerned.
Yep.
It's a photorealistic prop. I know when the very first Spider-Man movie came out in 2002, the Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire, a lot of the bits of Spider-Man flying through the New York City skyline was done by CGI rather than having Tobey Maguire swing on a rope from the Chrysler Building to the Empire State Building. I think it was Roger Ebert in his review of the original, and of course this is now more than 20 years old, the original 2002 Spider-Man. His complaint is that the CGI of Spider-Man flying looked about as convincing as an illustration of Mighty Mouse from the 1950s. And that's a fair point. CGI, to my mind, is not as convincing as these practical effects. Jurassic Park, of course, being the exception to that.
I've spent the weekend watching Invasion of the Dinosaurs. Don't get me started on unrealistic dinosaurs.
I love when the dinosaur tries to attack the Stegosaurus by jabbing its eye into the Stegosaurus' spike. That's really good fighting.
He just wants a cuddle.
So let's try and drag this thing bodily back on topic to Keys of Marinus. Is Keys of Marinus, all the bloopers and flubs and cardboard cutouts aside, is Keys of Marinus a good tale by Terry Nation?
I think it's a splendid tale. I think it's very easy to look at the first story and go, the first episode is the greatest thing ever. And as I've said before, I love the other three. And then you see the Daleks, nothing has ever been made like that on TV. And then you get a historical, well, the BBC can do historicals, that's all fine. And then you get the Keys of Marinus. The Keys of Marinus is more influential for the future of Doctor Who than any of the preceding stories and most of the stories that follow, with the exception of Dalek Invasion of Earth. Because the Keys of Marinus shows a young Stephen Moffat what Doctor Who can look like if you just cut out all the boring bits and skip to the next chapter.
Huh. Wow.
How's that for an absolute?
I've literally never heard that perspective before, but it is so right that I am now reprocessing in my brain. Because you're right, instead of a 4-part story on the Snows of Terror, and instead of a 2-part story of the Screaming Jungle, and instead of the 6-part, the trial of a science teacher, you get all of these things as 25-minute serials. So you're right, there's absolutely no padding, because you get 25 minutes of brains in a jar and that's it. You get 25 minutes of the jungle strangling William Hartnell's stunt double and that's it. You get 25 minutes of Altos in short shorts running through the snow being chased by, we're never told if they're robots or actual soldiers or demons or what. And then it's quickly on to the next story, and it's just rapid fire storytelling for 1964. And the budget cannot remotely do what Terry Nation wants it to do, but the book captivated me in the summer of '85 because it's fast-paced storytelling, and every 2 chapters is a new world. And the TV story is trying to do the same thing. You're right; it's very Moffat-y storytelling.
or at least Bob Baker and Dave Martin. Bob Baker and Dave Martin are, that kind of thing. It's the job of the writer to imagine the impossible, and then it's the job of the director and the production team to scale it back as far as it needs to go. So Bob Baker and Dave Martin, their flaw was their imagination was way more ambitious than anyone was prepared for, with pretty much every single story. And again, I think with Russell T Davies, we're now hearing stories of Disney saying you can be more ambitious on your first episode, apparently. But he has that mentality of, I know what we can achieve and I'm going to write around that, and then I'm going to find out whether or not we can have a horse jump through a mirror. But people like Terry Nation works out very quickly. There's a formula to this. He's both brilliant and lazy. I think a lot of brilliant people are quite lazy. They get used to being able to find an answer quicker than everyone else. So he does this story, and then he does Dalek Invasion of Earth, and then he does this story again as The Chase, and then he does this story again as the Daleks' Master Plan. But each time Doctor Who attempts this, it gets better at it. So you get the mechanoid jungle, and it's the best jungle we've seen so far. The next time we get that jungle in Dalek's Master Plan, it's better again, and we've got a better director as well. So in that way, Keys of Marinus is advancing this show, so we can do serial drama. We can have a story arc, but we can also have individual adventures where we go to a snow planet and we go to a jungle and we go to a courtroom and someone's front room, and then we go back to a citadel surrounded by acid. That's brilliant.
And you also have George Coulouris, who had been in Citizen Kane, playing Arbitan in part 1. And you have to imagine what's going through his head. 20 years ago, I was part of Orson Welles' repertory, and now I'm acting in a very cramped studio in front of a cardboard prop falling down a well. What's happened to my career?
The thing that surprised me about George Coulouris is I wondered where he might be from. With a name like Coulouris, you might think, oh, what's his heritage? He's from Manchester.
Huh.
He's a Mancunian. He grew up in terraced houses very similar to Coronation Street. he was, I think it was 1903 he was born, so he would have been growing up in the slums of Manchester. But obviously with a theatrical ambition, he would have lost his accent very, very quickly. Weirdly, you can still hear the odd little vowel sound of Manchester. There's a few little very flat vowel sounds when he's talking, but otherwise he's your Shakespearean, your theatrical accent. There's a lovely thing I found in the archives, which was recorded a few months before this. I'm not sure what the recording dates or what the difference in recording dates would have been. Would this be in early 1964 when they recorded it? It would only be, I think, maybe 6 or 7 weeks at most. So in the previous June, he did a thing for BBC Radio, where he's interviewing Betty Davis, because he'd been in 3 movies with Betty Davis, and it's a lovely little conversation. And it's great hearing him speaking to Betty Davis, who's come over to London to promote something, and she is fiery and she's cantankerous. At one point, the producer starts speaking to her, and he says, when you're doing your Betty Davis thing, and she loses her temper. I was going to say something sweary then. She loses her temper so furious. How dare you? I have never done a Betty Davis thing. They're completely different roles. And you think, here's George Coulouris. She says, George will tell you. And George has been in 3 different movies with her. And he's like, oh, yes, you're always completely different. Always.
I do not. This has become a legend that my imitators have emblazoned in the brains of everybody. Jane was a thick, plodding, clumsy woman. I'm very quick-moving and completely different than this.
But you were very recognizably the same person in all
Well,
the films.
naturally I'm the same person. That's the only way to start them, if you're really a different person in every film. No, I'm really tired of this. There's not one thing I did in Jane like I have done in other performances. Let me assure you. Those awful, cloppy I walk like a streak, Jane Slot.
It's true, I remember that lope for the first day on the set in Watch on the Rhine.
Watch on the Rhine, because I was a very calm, placid, organized woman. I would like to show you about 5 performances and just get rid of this legend that I do the same thing every time. Yes. Because I am one of the few to brag a bit who does not do the same thing every time. But I work very hard at playing different people, and I do. And if you can find one part of Betty Davis as that horrible Jane Hudson, I'll make you a big bet. Because I was a heavy, thick, drunken, psychotic, gone dame with no life left in her except hate. That's a different matter.
Well, it was a terrific star performance, one of about at least a dozen sort of really great star performances that you've given. And I wonder if you've
there must
a word
be
that
some.
we're tired of, but do you think of yourself as a star or as an actress?
A star.
But it's strange, he's clearly just looking for work, frankly. I suspect he's, like every actor, he's just looking for work. He's an interviewer for the BBC Radio. He's doing other things at the same time. And then he does, we think of it as one episode, but it's only really 2 scenes. He's only really in 2 big scenes, and then he's gone. But that's kind of, he wasn't really a big star, but he was a familiar face. He would be someone that people recognise. But certainly for the production to get George Coulouris, they would feel that was quite a big thing.
So let's get back to how revolutionary the storytelling is. You have the Screaming Jungle, and as you say, Terry Nation, and then Doctor Who later goes back to Screaming Jungles over and over again throughout the 1970s, especially once Roger Murray Leach shows you how to build an actual functioning jungle set with running water. Snows of Terror, you come back to the Seeds of Doom, which is really the Snows of Terror Part 2. You have the Brains in Jars is a very B-movie. I'm not so sure that Doctor Who goes back to tell that kind of story again, but it's an iconic image, Barbara smashing the brains in the jars, even if you have the sound effect of the jars smashing while the jars on screen are not actually smashing. But again, you suspension of disbelief.
This is how good Barbara is. She shatters those jars, having not connected with any of them, through sheer willpower, because that's how amazing Barbara is. Or maybe it's just the lacquer on her hair knocked them out. Maybe that's what it was.
Well, Barbara drove a truck through a fleet of Daleks 25 years before Ace took a baseball bat to one Dalek. So Barbara Wright is, the original assassin.
And where is her action figure? Where is it?
In my imagination. Just like the lush, flawless version of Keys of Marinus, entirely in my imagination. And I've said this many times, reading the courtroom scenes of Marinus in a hotel lobby in 1985, the same month that I saw Stones of Blood, launched me on the career that I have now. So the courtroom stuff here really set me on a path for the rest of my life. And Doctor Who will come back and do trials over and over again, not just the War Games and trial of a Time Lord, but there's also the trial sequences in the Mutants and the trial sequences in Stones of Blood. And Terry Nation does a trial scene very, very well. I would argue that William Hartnell coming back after 2 weeks holiday and volunteering to be Ian's lawyer is the first time that you stand up and cheer for the Doctor. It's the first time that he becomes the hero at the star of the show rather than the antagonist. And the first thing he does when he's appointed as Ian's counsel is ask for a postponement. So this is the most realistic portrayal of lawyers that you will ever see on television until Better Call Saul comes along 45 years later. So Terry Nation does a really, really good and accurate trial scene. And then there's the Perry Mason / Scooby-Doo twist, where it turns out that, let's unmask this person and see, oh, it was the prosecutor all along. Spoiler alert. And the Doctor's the only one to figure out where the missing piece of evidence is hidden inside the murder weapon. And then the part 5 cliffhanger is the first time that you really have a double cliffhanger, because sentence of death refers not just to Ian, but also refers to Susan, who's now been kidnapped and threatened with death at the exact same time. So this is amazing storytelling.
Again, we say that, well, I say that this is the most influential story of that period. Can you think of a future episode of Doctor Who where there's a trial and it turns out that the prosecutor is in fact the villain? Mm-hmm. And they took 14 weeks to get to that point. Terry Nation is amazing. This is madness, I know, but just to go back to the novelization of this story for a second, we love looking at when the authors give us a word that we've never seen. Now, you, I'm sure, would know this word. I've never seen this word before reading this book. And also, I've got a weak R, so it's very difficult for me to say. Peroration. The concluding part of a speech typically intended to inspire enthusiasm in the audience, which is the word that Philip Hinchcliffe chooses to describe William Hartnell's speech in the courtroom. And I love any word that makes me scurry off to a dictionary and look it up and find out what I'm missing.
I started law school in 1995. Before I retired from the practice of law and took on my current job, I was a practicing attorney for at least 20 years. We do not use the word peroration here in the States. We do not use it in written documents. We do not use it in trials. We do not use it in appellate arguments. I don't know. Again, I'm not particularly up on the British legal system, apart from what I've seen in Witness for the Prosecution and Stones of Blood with the wigs. I don't know if that's a word that's actually used, but it's not a word that's used in the States. But I had the expectation this was an actual thing because I read this first. It was one of my first fictional trials. So I thought it was a word that was going to be important. And then, of course, it turns out not to be important at all, at least in American law.
You're going to be casually throwing words like sagacity around left, right, and centre, aren't you? I was hoping that I'd mispronounced it just so that I could throw in a joke about you being judge, jury, and elocutioner.
Well, after Paul Scoons and I last week had trouble pronouncing the word Armageddon, I think you're right on track.
Oh, I'm halfway through listening to that one, by the way. It's lovely to hear Paul again.
Oh, that was a fun episode. He's gonna come back. We're gonna have him back for a future episode. One thing I loved about this book is that Philip takes a black and white story and he restores it to full color. And
Yes.
He tells you what everything looks like in a way that you will never see on television because it's all monochrome. I think it was the Doctor Who magazine review of this novelization, which has the infamous line, "I look forward with horror to your next book," because the reviewer of the Keys of Marinus novelization was not a fan. I just don't see it that way at all. I read this book at 11 years old, and it literally changed my life. And even though it's short, I think Philip, and I'm not just saying this because I had him on the show, he writes a good techno thriller. He thinks about the story and he puts in colors because you can't see it on television where it's black and white. And he uses words like peroration. He even includes a deleted scene that was not on television. I think this is a very good book for the early '80s Target novelization era. And I think the DWM review is quite uncharitable.
Well, they often were. it's it's that strange thing of fan reviews where they want to be the one to stick the knife in. It's only when you get to, I think, like Gary Gillett's reviews for the DVD range, where he set himself the challenge of trying to find something new to say, whether it was good or bad. Where finally you get a reviewer who isn't, his thing is, where's the joke? Where are we going to with this? What's the story? Rather than, here's my opinion about why they made 58 mistakes in making this. It's not about finding the errors. It's about recognizing what's good or bad about the errors. You know, when we look at Hartnell and he's fluffing his way through certain scenes, and then you find out that's an acting choice a lot of the time. It's actually either scripted or that's him choosing to fluff his way through. Except when he says, "If you'd have had your shoes on, you could have given her hers," which was a fluff.
Yes, or burnt cinders floating around in Spain. But yeah, I've been going through as I watch the season 2 Blu-rays. I'm looking at the the rehearsal and the camera scripts on the BD-ROM.
Yeah.
And you can see that Hartnell is adding the hums and the ahs into these sentences that isn't scripted. He's putting it in.
I mean, we get a bit clouded, I think, because we all now watch Hartnell knowing that he was struggling with his lines in a lot of the stories, but I don't think he is this early on. I think one of the benefits we have is that we have actors who can be edited into some sort of coherence nowadays, whereas then they had to do it as live. I was about to name names and I thought, no, I better not. But there is certainly one modern performance in very recent years who is created entirely in the edit and not in the performance.
Huh.
I'll leave you to guess which guest star in a Christmas special that refers to.
Answers on a postcard,
Or,
please.
sorry, a seasonal special. And when you're looking at, there are so many. I mean, George Coulouris is stumbling his way through his 2 scenes as well, and I think it's just impressive that they can get to the end of a sentence and it makes some sort of sense. I struggle. I've got notes in front of me right now just to remind myself to stay on topic. And look how well I've done there.
You should hear how many takes my script for the novelization reviews often takes at the end of these recordings. You say that this is the most influential story of season 1. I think that the Sensorites is also much more influential than the Daleks. I think the Sensorites in many ways is a better story, not a better production, but certainly a better story. And I'll explain that when the Sensorites episode comes around. The Sensorites is full of fluffs that sound way better than the written line would ever be. Like, I overheard them talking is just a functional line, but when the actor says, "I heard them over talking," that's the version that's stuck in my head. I say that all the time now.
Didn't you, though? I heard them over talking. Yeah. Of course they did. I mean, I don't know. I think the Sensorites is what Doctor Who was, but I think Keys of Marinus is what Doctor Who could be. It was aspirational. I think the Sensorites, they can get some men in some stretch fabric and a mask to walk around a set, but to have a deadly jungle and the snow, the deadly snows, and then the deadly courtroom, you've got it's really impressive, I think. But I do think that the way that Philip Hinchcliffe describes all the locales mainly does make them very cinematic.
One last point in defense of the Sensorites, and I realize this is not a Sensorites episode, but it is an obsession with me. The Daleks are fascist robots. Hooray, that's very original. The Sensorites are philosophical aliens who are scared of the dark. I think that is the much more interesting storytelling choice.
Yeah.
As for
Yeah.
the Vord, we don't quite know what the Vord are. Are the Vord aliens? Are the Vord just citizens of Marinus wearing funny helmets? The story never does quite go the extra mile to tell us.
I mean, obviously, we've got the future history of this, where like in the comic books, and eventually in the Capaldi era, we're told that the Vord are a form of Cybermen. But even here,
Yes.
Philip Hinchcliffe is his description of them is leaning into Cybermen a little bit, isn't he? When he talks about the a snoutish protuberance like corrugated piping. Well, where have we seen corrugated piping in the Hinchcliffe era?
Hmm.
And then he talks about it looking like the face as a whole faintly resembled that of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of Egyptian mythology. We've seen Egyptian mythology in your era, haven't we, Phil? Although I love the fact that he does all these things and then he kind of depth charges it by going, the creature, however, was far from being any sort of god. And then he gets a really clumsy summation of it all. It was, in fact, a Class 1 Vord assault trooper programmed to kill enemy life form. If he'd have just said it was a Vord and then said an assault trooper programmed to kill enemy life forms, or even not programmed, but trained. But he's trying to hint at something other than just a man in a suit. So I admire him for trying without going too far or deviating too far from what we actually would have seen at the time, which is a clumsy man in a suit.
So, Keys of Marinus, you say, is a very influential story on the young Stephen Moffat. We both agree that it's much better than it looks on camera, and the ambition is certainly there. Let's just do a quick hit and talk about each of the segments. I've talked about the trial scene. What do you think works about the trial sequence, the snows of terror, the screaming jungle, and the brains in jars?
Your regular contributor, Graham Burke, your friend of mine, Graham Burke, his childhood best friend, Rob Jones, lived in my house when I lived in London. Well, we all shared a house together when we lived in London. And Rob had this lovely phrase where you're watching a B movie and then it gets to a point where you get a brain hooked up to a machine. And he used to get so excited, go, oh my word, brains hooked up to machines. And he'd exalt the moment. And so when I see the brains presumably hooked up to machines because they haven't got any vocal cords, so there's something doing the talking for them. I love B-movie stuff. There's a reason why B-movies were quite popular. And I just love the fact that Terry Nation will go, I'm going to start you here, and then, look, they're going to be dismantling this set, so we might as well build a different one next week. So let's have that. And we can come back to that really expensive set we bought in the final episode. But let's just see what you've got in stock. So we've got a black cycler armor. Let's put some nice chairs in front of it and pretend it's this beautiful, elaborate, baroque society. And then let's get some potted plants and some rubber plants and just fling them around the black cycler armor and see what we can get away with there. And then let's get as much polystyrene as we can get and just fill the studio with it, and that'll do. But this is what TV looked like. I mean, if they were doing... Stephen Moffat often jokes about the fact that, Doctor Who couldn't do a convincing spaceship, but Z-Cars couldn't do a convincing car. And I love the ambition with this. And I find it very easy to watch old Doctor Who and see it as metaphor or not even question it. I just go, this is what it is. In a way that is much, much harder to do when I see bad design in modern stuff.
See, the trial sequence has two actors who came back to Doctor Who in the 1980s, and Donald Pickering and Fiona Walker. So this is terrific casting. No matter what the flaws of the production, John Gorey's casting is on point. In the Snows of Terror, you have Francis DeWolf, who was pretty much a recurring figure in the movies at that point. He was in the Alistair Sim version of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol, and he had been, a few months before doing this, he had been in From Russia with Love. He owns the part that he's in. And yes, chasing Barbara around the table and trying to assault her is a bit suspect, perhaps, to the modern eye. I think Francis DeWolf is one of the best guest stars that we've had in Doctor Who up to this point because he owns that episode. And especially in a story that doesn't have William Hartnell in it, you need that larger than life figure, and I think Francis DeWolf was most certainly that.
And he's
And then
terrifying,
is
isn't
brought
he?
back 2 years later to be in the Mythmakers for the same reason.
Yeah, he's the physical presence of him where you think he's not got a ray gun, he's not got an axe, he's just got very big hands that can strangle a wolf.
Uh-huh.
That is terrifying. And then, of course, you've got the voice of Yartek, leader of the alien Vord, Stephen Dartnell. And he comes back just a few weeks later in The Sensorites.
Which brings us full circle. All right, you have said more good things about the Keys of Marinus than have ever been said about the Keys of Marinus before in any medium on any platform. So let's segue from there to a game. We are going to play a game this week, but not the game that you were expecting. I'm going to challenge you because I suspect you're going to be very good at it. I'm going to challenge you to guess that cliffhanger. Are you ready?
Oh, no. But you'll do it anyway.
Here is your first clip.
We'll have to evacuate this place. But we can't leave now. We can't let that thing loose over London. It's no good, sir. The weapons are jamming. Look out, sir. Right, everybody back under cover.
That is your first cliffhanger. I think this is a very iconic one and a very famous one, and I think it's pretty easy. What do you think it is?
Well, the story is the War Machines.
I guess the War Machine gave it away.
A little bit, yeah. But oh, see, this is the problem when you've grown up watching Doctor Who stories in one go. It's only in recent years that I've started rationing myself, so I'd only watch 2 episodes at a time. So I'm gonna say, where are the cliffhangers in the War Machines? The first one is, I think it's the cliffhanger to episode 3.
You are correct. It is the third and final cliffhanger.
I'm amazed how tense this feels and how excited I am I got one right. So, okay. Maybe you were right after all. Maybe I was over-prepared for the guess the story one. This is fun. Okay.
You get 2 out of 3 is a passing score, and nobody has failed yet. This one, I think, is also iconic. And
challenge accepted.
I don't think it'll be a problem. Here we go.
It's episode 1. It's episode 1 of Deadly Assassin.
You are correct. All right, we're now going to pick a third one. And here we go.
Monument, that's Tower Hill next. Hey, wait a minute. Did you hear something? What? Listen. Look! The fungus is here! We better get out fast! We're trapped! We've had it, Doyle. We can't go forward and we can't go back.
All right, that was your third and final clip. What do you think it was?
It's Web of Fear, and it's I've just illustrated this, and I'm trying to remember the order in which the pictures appear, and then trying to work out where the. I think it's episode 4.
Episode 4. See, episode 4 is probably one of the greatest 5 individual 25.
Oh no, it's episode 3 going into 4.
Okay.
Is that right?
It is. You have the story right. It is the wrong episode. I'll give you one more chance, knowing that it's not 3 or 4.
Well, it must be 2 then.
It is. See, episode 4 is one of my favorites, and that's got this. Episode 4 is so downbeat because every single member of the guest cast is killed off in increasingly horrific ways.
Yeah.
And then at the end of episode 4, just when you think it can't get any worse, our old friend Travers comes back and he's possessed by the intelligence. So
Yes.
episode 4 is Doctor Who at its most nihilistic. This is definitely not episode 4. Other than that, it could be anything because it's a pretty generic cliffhanger. So I'm going to give you the half point.
The scenes I think move around in the book as well. But
Yes.
yeah, thank you. That was good. That was good. I was just thinking. Yeah, I was leaning into. I completely forgot that episode 4 is the best episode of anything ever, apart from episode 1, which is the best episode 1 of anything ever.
Well, I've taken up way too much of your time, but you've done a stunning job at Guess That Cliffhanger. You get 5 out of 6, which is not perfect, but it is definitely more than passing. And you've given me some great things to think about, Keys of Marinus, that nobody's ever thought of before. So I think that after this episode drops, there's going to be a massive reevaluation of the Keys of Marinus in fandom. And it's all attributable to you, my friend.
Or there's going to be a massive reevaluation of me. Well, I do have my little surprise up my sleeve, don't I?
Yes, you do.
In the form of, to make up for that, in the form of limericks, because I know that you like limericks, don't you?
The Listener Limerick Challenge is a staple of both this podcast and the Trap One podcast.
And I misunderstood the brief for the Trap One podcast because I didn't realise that you would be supplying limericks and we had to guess the last line. So I just went away and wrote loads of limericks for that, and then you were like, that's not how it plays. No. But you did use some of mine anyway, so that was fun. But I haven't done 6. I've done 5 limericks. But they do tell the story roughly in order.
So let's do this as a challenge. I'm going to guess the last word.
Okay. You will not be able to do this. On an island surrounded by acid, a machine's making everyone placid. Then an alien horde of rubber-clad Vord discover their flippers are...
flaccid.
Yes! Never have 2 men been so excited by the word flaccid. When...
it never will be again.
When Barbara wakes with surprise, she's distracted by Altos's thighs. She runs off in fright and ends up in a fight with some brains and their googly
eyes.
Yes. Actually, you might do okay on this one.
In Limerick 1, we've had the word flaccid, and in 2, we've had distracted by thighs. I'm going to have to change the rating on this episode from G to NC-17.
I think it's going to be okay for the rest of it. There is some mild peril coming up. When the ice soldiers all start to thaw, the viewers may think it's a bore. The soldiers in wonder head off across the tundra, killing Francis de Wolf through a...
door.
Yes! This one is specifically written with you in mind.
Uh-oh. That means I'm not going to get it.
Yes, deliberately. In search of the Marinus keys, the Doctor suspiciously flees. While the mission gets perilous, he jumps to Millennius to confound with obscure...
legalese.
Yes! And finally, And I think that's what everyone will be feeling after week 6 of this nonsense as well. With Arbitan stabbed through the heart, old Yartek still thinks that he's smart. But his bogus key code makes the conscience explode. If he'd only done that at the
Start. All right. Now, the audience can't see this, but Smudge has been sitting next to me the whole time, and she is staring into the webcam, glaring at you. Even though I'm wearing a headset and she can't hear the rhyme, she knows from my expression that something bad is going on, and she's giving you the stare of death right now.
It's time to go home.
It looks like the cliffhanger to part 1 of the Planet of Giants, actually, because of the way the cat is staring at you. Well, Jim, you have crushed it this week. I'll speak to you real soon, Jim. Take care.
Best
now.
of luck. You take care.
Doctor Who and the Keys of Marinus, written by Philip Hinchcliffe, televised as The Keys of Marinus, teleplay by Terry Nation, televised in April and May 1964, published in August 1980. Marinus, a remote, force-shielded island set in a sea of acid, governed by the Conscience, the ultimate computer which rules and balances the gentle life of Marinus, guarded by Arbitan, the Keeper, ruthless protector of a peace-loving race, threatened by Yartek, warlord of the brutal subhuman Vords, sworn enemy of Arbitan and of Marinus, who has within his grasp the keys of Marinus, the conscience's vital microcircuits, the doors of good and evil. Can the Doctor find the hidden circuits in time? Arbitan's command was, find them or die. How do you, in 1980, an era of glorious color, begin to adapt a black and white TV production from more than 16 years earlier? By writing a lavish opening paragraph telling you what all the colors are. Enter Philip Hinchcliffe. The day, like every day on Marinus, started clear and bright. The walls of the great city shimmered in the early morning heat, and a mile away, the dazzling green sea washed gently against the silver shore. Between the two lay a terrain of twisted, gleaming rock, as if molten glass had spilled from the ground and solidified before reaching the sea. This desolate, burnished landscape was devoid of life. Only the sun, throwing creeping shadows into the numerous rock pools, lent movement to the scene. Once you remember what story is being adapted, a low-budget monochrome which, to this day, has possibly the highest number of on-screen bloopers of any classic series Doctor Who serial, that opening paragraph is a visual feast. And so is the next one, where Hinchcliffe turns the Vord into a military attack force in a techno-thriller paragraph that I was not expecting from the writer whose 2 previous novelizations, Seeds of Doom and Mask of Mandragora, were less concerned with military precision. Page 5. At 701 zeniths, intergalactic time precisely, 3 BXV sub-oceanic assault craft penetrated Marinian territorial waters at a depth of 50 sonars. Fitted with anti-met radar devices, they sped undetected to within 100 yards of the shore before surfacing and slithering onto the wide beach. For several minutes, the BXVs lay there, glistening in the sun like giant slugs. Then, one of the outer casings was pushed open, and a shiny black hand emerged, its webbed fingers clawing the air for support. The Vord invasion of Marinus had begun. Most of the next 3 pages are devoted to introducing the TARDIS crew, the original TARDIS crew. For Hinchcliffe, this is introductory material, as the Hartnell era was not his era of the show, as we heard him say earlier. And for the readers of August 1980, the introduction is an absolute necessity, as this was the first novelization of a Hartnell era serial in almost 3.5 years. The last one before this was the Dalek invasion of Earth, way back in March 1977, and as John Peel and I discussed here way back in episode 30, when this podcast was less than half its present size, and assuming that you had lots of children under 14 reading this book when it came out, well, anyone that age wouldn't even have been born when the Hartnell era ended. And you'd have to be at least 20 years old to even remember having watched Susan and Ian and Barbara on TV. So this introductory material is A, necessary for the young reader, and B, entertaining and cleverly written in its own right. Quote, "The Doctor's bossy tone meant he was getting excited." Hinchcliffe punctuates Chapter 1 with lots of observations like these about the TARDIS crew. He also adapts the dialogue pretty liberally, removing strained attempts at comedy, like the Doctor explaining to the black and white viewing audience why the TARDIS doesn't have a color monitor, or Ian's jokes about what wearing heavy boots will do to Susan's feet. The introduction to the Vord is memorable, both in terms of the description of its appearance and the hints of its military command structure. Page 11. Behind her, keeping carefully to the cover of the larger rocks, a strange figure set off in pursuit. Despite its clumsy webbed feet, the creature slithered soundlessly over the polished stones. It was roughly the size and shape of a man, but more agile and strong in its movements. Its skin was dark and rubbery, its bullet-shaped head smooth and devoid of features, except for 2 frog-like eyes and a snoutish protuberance like corrugated piping. The head was flanked by 2 flat, pointed lugs. The face, as a whole, faintly resembled that of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of Egyptian mythology. The creature, however, was far from being any sort of god. It was, in fact, a Class 1 Vord assault trooper, programmed to kill enemy life forms on sight. In fact, Hinchcliffe is all about references to antiquity in Chapter 1. Apart from Anubis, Susan later compares the Great Pyramid of Marinus to the ones in Egypt, or to the ancient cities of Babylon. One minor difference between TV and print is that Barbara's line on TV, as a history teacher, about where on earth you can find pyramids, such as the one on Marinus, is reassigned to Ian. Chapter 2 gives us a satisfying glimpse of what a Vord probably looks like outside of its rubber wetsuit. Quote, "It was humanoid, but with reptilian hands and feet. Its head was smooth and oval, with bulbous eyes and flat ears." Page 23 gives us an excellent description of the TARDIS, the gray version of which appears on the book's original cover illustration. Page 23. The TARDIS rested on the beach, like an abandoned toy. The fierce sun beat down on the peeling blue paintwork, highlighting its tatty, battered appearance. Anything less like a sophisticated space-time machine would be difficult to find. But looks deceive. The TARDIS and its master may have seemed decrepit and unreliable on the surface, but both harbored powers which had eluded countless civilizations since the dawn of time itself. There are several plot holes in Nation's script, which, to be fair, was written as a last-minute replacement in a show that was then producing 52 episodes in 52 weeks. Everything from An Unearthly Child through Flashpoint was made as part of the same production block. So any problem in the script would basically have to stay there. Hinchcliffe does not provide an explanation as to why Arbitan sends the TARDIS crew on their quest for the keys without giving them the necessary information about where to find them or which traps to avoid. Of course, there's no adventure to be had without that, so I'm not sure what Hinchcliffe could have done to fix this. Maybe Arbitan's saying, "Oh, wait, I forgot to give you after the travelers have departed the pyramid, and as the last surviving Vord stabs him to death."
We always hope to find a way of modifying it and making it again irresistible. So instead of destroying it, we remove the 5 key microcircuits.
What did you do with them?
One of them I kept. There it is. The other 4 were taken and put in places of safety all over Marinus. Only I know where they are. And now the time has come when they must be recovered.
Well, why don't you simply make new keys?
The keys are very simple, but the microcircuits inside are very complicated. A permutation of numbers and signals that would take 1,000 years to unravel. And besides, Since the keys were hidden, I have worked on this machine and modified it so that when they're replaced...
And when they're replaced, it would mean that your machine is irresistible and you can overcome and control the boards again.
Yes.
Yes.
Surely there must be someone you can send for these keys.
Through the years, all my friends, all my followers have gone. They have never returned. Last year, I sent my daughter. She has not come back. All I have now to comfort me is the distant echo of her voice, the imagined sound of her footsteps. But now your coming has brought new hope. Oh, yes, yes. You must find the keys for me.
And that's George Coulouris of Citizen Kane giving an appropriately manic performance. Bug eyes, waving hands, walking right up to the camera, and delivering exposition practically right into the lens. I love the intimacy of those Lime Grove D stories. Everything right up close. Rich blues and purples, deep vermilion. Page 28. It's the beginning of Chapter 3, The Velvet Web, and the beginning of the Episode 2 material. Keys of Marinus, as Philip and I discussed earlier, was done up as a series of mini-adventures. Episode 2 is nearly a self-contained story, set in the city of Morpheton, not to be revisited over the remainder of the serial. Hinchcliffe, though, again gives us a sense of the sights and colors and sounds of this city, not available on the monochrome broadcast video, except that the Doctor misidentifies a green fruit as a pomegranate on the next page, though the pomegranate would be an appropriate symbol for the city of Morpheton, as some scholars of the Torah believe this to be the forbidden fruit of the Adam and Eve story. One small but significant change to the Episode 2 material is that in the book, Barbara removes the metal disc from her forehead, which enables her to see through the velvet web illusion of the city of Morpheton. On TV, the disc falls off her forehead as she rolls over while sleeping, which gives the character more agency in the book. And Hinchcliffe continues to turn a poetic phrase on almost every page, making the book profound in spite of its modest 124-page length. As Barbara sees through the illusion of the city, she reflects on page 35 that, quote, everywhere was not richness and beauty, but filth and squalor. A few pages later, she laments, everyone she met in this place seemed incapable of carrying on a normal conversation. Aladdin's Cave gets a shout-out on page 38, this time Hinchcliffe citing a famous fictional locale rather than a real one. Lavish and descriptive prose aside, this is a straightforward adaptation in terms of scenes in scene order. The dialogue is condensed in spots. A longer passage late in Episode 2 on TV is deleted and replaced only with the description, quote, a brief consultation. Even though this was your typical Season 1 studio-bound only story, Hinchcliffe works the imagination and gives us a jungle setting in the Episode 3 material that exceeds Lime Grove D's dimensions. Page 47, quote, some of the trees were over 200 feet tall, their massive branches interlaced to form a canopy of green which blotted out the sun. Lower down, a subsidiary growth of vines and creepers stretched from trunk to trunk, creating a second, denser ceiling, which had enclosed the wall like a giant green wave. Actually, the screaming jungle of Episode 3, with its living plants, is strongly reminiscent of the Seeds of Doom, a Hinchcliffe-era story, in which he novelized himself and discussed with me back in Episode 29. If the 1980s comics and the Peter Capaldi episode The Doctor Falls established that Marinus is one planet that evolved Cybermen, maybe some other canonical source can establish that the Krynoid were born or evolved right here on Marinus, too. There's a rare grammatical error on page 57, chapter 6, in a paragraph about Darius. At least that's the name he's credited under on TV. The name is not spoken aloud in the episode and is not mentioned in the book. Hinchcliffe uses the word he in a paragraph about Darius' death struggle, but referring to Ian, who's not mentioned anywhere else in that paragraph. The next page, 58, contains a Terry Nation plot hole, as a dying Darius tells Ian and Barbara that only couriers sent by Arbitan would have knowledge of the traps set in Darius' house. Gee, that would have been really useful information for Arbitan to have dispensed in Episode 1, Though, of course, there'd be a lot less story in Episode 3 had Arbitan properly done that. The Episode 3 material runs only 17 pages long, and Hinchcliffe's excellent descriptive prose only just covers up those plot holes. Why did Darius, a friend of Arbitan, hiding out with one of the Keys of Marinus, try to accelerate the tempo of nature's destruction? What happens a week, a month, a year after this story? Surely the jungle must eventually overrun the entire planet and strangle everyone to death, like that killer weed in Stephen King's Creepshow. Fortunately, this material is just 17 pages, out of a book that runs 124, 1/6 of the TV serial, but less than 1/6 of the page count, meaning that Hinchcliffe has wisely reserved more space for the other, perhaps more logical installments. The novelization is on firmer ground, adapting Episode 4, The Snows of Terror, which would have been my favorite mini-adventure within the story, if not for the legal drama coming up after that. Vazor gets a great description, first as a coarse, hideous face with lumpen features, and then further down the same page, page 63, like a Bruegel peasant. Another great comparison point by the author. The Chapter 7 material, where Vazor impliedly tries to rape Barbara on TV, takes on a slightly different tenor, with the author's cliffhanger to the chapter. Quote, "Fingers like steel pincers bit into her throat, slowly throttling her." Chapter 8 contains another moment from Nation's script that's hard to fix in print. Ian, after forcing the villainous Vazor to bring them into the heart of the ice mountain, stupidly leaves Vazor all alone on the other side of the rope bridge, which Vazor promptly cuts, leaving Ian and the others stranded inside the mountain. That's a popular TV trope called the idiot plot right there. Again, you can't fix this in a novelization of the TV story, but Hinchcliffe at least acknowledges the absurdity of what he's been given by mentioning that Ian is angry with himself for having allowed that to happen. And even more cuttingly, as the travelers look to find material with which to rebuild the bridge inside an ice mountain, Hinchcliffe writes, in best Terrence Dicks, mocking the plot style, "The likelihood of finding the right materials was so remote as to be laughable." Then again, channeling the best of Terrence, Philip adds an action/stunt sequence, where there was none, on TV. Page 79. Susan was 3 feet from the far side of the crevice when she felt the bridge give way. She hurled herself across the remaining gap. Her fingers clawed desperately at the rim of the chasm. For one agonizing moment, it seemed she was slithering to her death, but she dug her fingernails into the icy surface and slowly pulled herself to safety. And then she hauled the broken end of the rope bridge and secured it firmly around the retaining pillar. Again, I like the Snows of Terror segment on TV more than you'd guess from listening to my criticisms of the plot holes above. It's only one 24-minute TV episode, which takes up just 19 pages of text, but it's got a vivid setting, a memorable human villain and the mysterious ice soldiers, and a satisfying violent finish as Vazor is killed, with Hinchcliffe specifying that he was axed in the kidneys by the ice soldier. Ouch! And Francis DeWolf gives a great performance as Vazor. It's one of the great single-episode guest performances, just about as interesting and as effective as George Calora's had been in Episode 1. On page 85, the minor character, Larn, part of the City of Millennius sequence, which takes up all of Episode 5 and half of 6, is described as having an open, friendly face. As this book came out, the Peter Davison era was still about 18 months in the future. But that expression will come back again and again when it comes time for the Davison episodes to be novelized. Page 86 sees William Hartnell's triumphant return to the page after a 42-page absence, the longest doctorless stretch of any Target book to date, and probably one that won't be rivaled until the new adventures. This was a function of the vacation schedule for the Season 1 production block. Each of the 4 leads got a 2-week break, Susan and the Aztecs, Barbara and the Sensorites, and Ian and the Reign of Terror, the next 3 serials after this one. That pattern of weeks off would last throughout the rest of the 1960s, but never again would the Doctor get more than 1 week off at a time. But the long absence works in establishing the Doctor's character. When the Doctor returns in episode 5 and volunteers to be Ian's defense counsel, it's really the character's first stand-up and cheer moment when you're watching the series in sequence. The prose version of that scene is equally enticing. The Doctor drew himself up to his full height. "I will defend you," he said. His eyes danced mischievously. Episode 5, Sentence of Death, is Doctor Who's first courtroom drama, and there aren't too many others behind this one. This may be one of the most realistic of them all. Eisen, the chief prosecutor, gives an opening statement in the book that's said to be 30 minutes long. That's accurate to real life. That's also an embellishment, as the corresponding character, played by Donald Pickering, one of 2 actors in the story who later came back during the Sylvester McCoy era, doesn't deliver one on screen. The Doctor, acting as Ian's defense counsel, given his very first opportunity to address the court, requests a postponement. That's also very, very accurate to what lawyers do in real life.
Our decision on the report of Chief Inquirer Taron is that the prisoner, Ian Chesterton, is guilty of murder and that his sentence is death. The said sentence to be administered 3 days after the end of this hearing, unless the representative for the accused can show positive proof why the execution should not be carried out. Will you stand up? Representative for the defense, you have a grave duty. You have offered your services in this matter, which complies with the laws of the city of Millennius, in that any person may speak on behalf of another. Are you acquainted with our laws?
Yes, I have studied some, my lord.
Every latitude will be allowed to you, and if you are at fault, I will give you directions.
Thank you.
The representative for the court, Eisen, has spoken his facts. You may now reply.
My lords, I cannot defend a man when I have not considered every aspect of the case. I must have time to examine witnesses, read statements, and to prepare my case. I object most strongly.
The demand is reasonable in itself. The crime of murder in Millennius is in itself unusual. Then I grant you 2 days.
Thank you, my lord. I congratulate you. Thank you. It will not alter the outcome. We shall see.
The first 2 pages of Chapter 10, pages 92 and 93, are, frankly, hilarious. Much of this is due to Terry Nation's dialogue. He's the first of many Doctor Who writers to realize that the Doctor works very well when he's playing Sherlock Holmes. Note the telltale elementary, that Hartnell gets to deliver on TV. But Hinchcliffe helps by leaning into this. On these 2 pages alone, the Doctor, quote, raises a forefinger dramatically, whispers theatrically, moves stealthily up behind Barbara, and simulates a violent blow to her head. This must have been tremendous fun to write, to narrate, to embellish. Barbara, we are told, winces. Quote, the Doctor's love of realism was a bit unnerving. On pages 94 and 95 is a scene between Ian, Sabitha, and Altos. This is a very rare thing in a Hinchcliffe novelization, a scene that does not appear on television. Sabitha and Altos explain to Ian the history of the laws behind the city and apologize for their draconian nature. No, not those draconians. Sabitha explains, I know the laws seem strange, but you must remember that when the keys were removed from the conscience, people had to make their own rules again. Chapter 10 has several other changes. Overheard dialogue between Aidan and Fiona Walker's character is removed from the book. So is Aidan's comically inept half-confession, you couldn't know where it is, and the business with Aidan beating his wife. Each of these omissions improves the book. When you're reading the target books in story order, as opposed to publication order, page 99 might well be the first time that you absolutely fall in love with the first Doctor. The Doctor rose to his feet. Compared with the tall, resplendent figure of his opponent, the Doctor created an almost comical impression with his dusty frock coat and straggly, long white hair. But his eyes, as they swept over the assembled courtroom, conveyed a powerful air of authority, and a sudden hush fell on the room. On the top of page 104 is a mistake, a dreadful mistake. However, of course, it is not Philip's mistake. It is, in fact, my own. I wrote, in teenage hand, in pencil, Part 6, in print, and in cursive, The Keys of Marinus, which was the on-screen title for Episode 6. I put it there because up until this point in the book, that's where all the cliffhangers had come, at the end of every even-numbered chapter. So it stood to reason that Episode 6 would begin with Chapter 11, the way that Episodes 2 through 5 begin with Chapters 3, 5, 7, and 9, respectively. Except that's not where Episode 6 ends. It ends 4 pages later, on mid-page 107, meaning that the Episode 5 material takes up almost 26 full pages of text, the longest episode in the book. It's really good stuff. A typo on page 111 turns the city of Millennius into the city of Millennium, but here the author gives us a glimpse of the city exteriors, which were not furnished on TV, in a typically poetic Hinchcliffe paragraph. Quote, at the far end of Central Avenue, the Capitol building towered high into the sky, pale and ghostly in the greenish-blue light of the night. And the Chapter 11 material, concluding the Millennius business, or if you will, the Millennium business, ends with a sentence that I still recall reading inside the Roosevelt Hotel on that Saturday in July 1985. Quote, he, that's Taran, smiled at Lauren with the satisfied air of a man who has solved a hitherto insoluble problem. Hinchcliffe lavishes a lot of attention on this material, and it's easy to see now, even though Nation's legal thriller / locked door mystery is not perhaps the most original work of courtroom fiction, why this captured my imagination at such a young age and helped prompt me on the path to law school and beyond. And even with that, Hinchcliffe does have to trim several bits of dialogue from the Millennius material to fit into the book, and losing surely the unscripted moment where Ian, Barbara, and Susan say in turn, ready, steady, go, as they dematerialize midway through Episode 6, taking us out of Millennius and back to the Great Pyramid of Marinus for the shocking endgame. Yartek is perhaps not the most memorable adversary of the Hartnell era, or even of the entire first season. He's only the antagonist in one half of the last episode, and he's defeated in exactly the same way as Fiona Walker's character earlier in the last episode, by a careless verbal slip that gives away his subterfuge. But Hinchcliffe does devote one effective scene to this bad guy's POV, spanning pages 118 and 19. Quote, Yartek stood before the large, spheroid structure in the archive room, the conscious of Marinus that had once been called. He admired its elegant lines. Thousands of years of technological skill had been distilled into this sleek, sophisticated machine, the enticing repository of all power and knowledge on Marinus. The conscience had been Yartek's lifetime adversary, the immutable obstacle between himself and his overriding ambition, control of Marinus. His secret immunizer had once nullified but not destroyed the machine's regulation of the planet. In the intervening years, the Keepers had reversed the effect of the immunizer so that, with the keys in place, the machine would once again exert its full power over all living creatures on the planet. Yartek's dream, to harness this energy and might for his own evil ends, was now within reach. In triumph, though, or in what he believes to be triumph, Yartek on page 122 emits a, quote, girlish giggle, which is not one of the more successful descriptions in the book. There are a lot of changes in Chapter 12. Some dialogue is trimmed. A bigger change is that on TV, the Doctor is never captured by the Vord. He unties Altos and Sabitha himself. In the book, Hinchcliffe has the Doctor captured and thrown into a cell with Altos and Sabitha, but Ian overpowers a guarding Vord, breaks into the cell, and frees everybody. And the prose finale is terrific, Yartek exulting over his final victory on page 125, followed by a vivid, full-color paragraph, both describing the temporarily revived conscience and depicting Yartek's death in Raiders of the Lost Ark-style graphic detail, before Raiders even hit the theater. Page 125. The gleaming, crystalline structure began to hum and quiver like a glass bell. A red glow appeared at the center, growing in intensity as the humming sound grew louder. Then, spokes of purple light radiated outwards along the delicate metal connectors until the entire structure blazed like a giant Catherine wheel. Suddenly, the entire machine burst apart with the force of an exploding sun. In 1/1,000,000th of a second, Yartek's flesh was seared to the bone, and the bone reduced to ash. The room, the guard, and 200 feet of surrounding masonry were simply scorched out of existence within the blink of an eye. An extra beat is also added to the climax to make the TARDIS crew's escape from the pyramid, just as it explodes, and in the book turns volcanic in a shower of vivid prose. Page 126. Quote, as they reached the safety of the shore, the earth began to shudder, and turning, they saw the apex of the pyramid topple. A tremendous spout of fire shot into the sky like a volcanic eruption. Molten rock cascaded down the outer walls, and within minutes, the entire edifice was a raging inferno, illuminating the heavens for miles around. The 2-page epilogue, Chapter 13, Final Goodbyes, is accurate and faithful to the TV script, but Hinchcliffe conveys its emotional content and its happy but somewhat bittersweet ending. This would be Philip's final novelization, and probably, unfortunately and sadly, his final appearance on this program, but it's a strong finish and a strong way to go out. Next time on Doctor Who Literature. It's still August 1980, a rare double release month for the Target line. We jump ahead impossibly far from Season 1 to Season 17. And as this came out just days before the Season 18 premiere, Part 1 of The Leisure Hive, the other book this month, is as close to the present day as the Targets can get. Join me and a returning guest for a look at Terrence Dix's pastel-covered adaptation of a very funny, if very clumsily made, sci-fi adventure. We've got starships colliding in space. We've got alien monsters in bell-bottom trousers. We've got a mad scientist with an impossibly Germanic accent, people clutching the stomach when getting shot on the shoulder, and an absolute and utter mismatch of acting styles from everybody in the guest cast. On TV, it was Nightmare in the recording studio, as a director got fired, ending his career within the BBC. But in print, it's merely Doctor Who and the Nightmare of Eden. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. I'm Jason, your host and editor and producer. Special thanks to my special guests this week, Philip Hinchcliffe and Jim Sangster. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's DrWho Novels. And you can find me on Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature @gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.